Welcome to the Miami Jewish Film Festival, the world's largest festival of its kind. We want to thank all of our members, sponsors, community partners, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, for their continued support throughout all these years. My name is Scott Bernstein. I'm on the board of SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and I'm excited to be moderating today a virtual conversation with director Elliot Levitt from the movie The Eichmann Trial, which is premiering at this festival. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome, Mr. Levitt. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us. This was really an amazing film, and I noticed from reviewing your background, you have a long history of being acknowledged for editing and work in film editing. But in this particular film, you took on the role of directing as well. Can you explain for our audience the difference between editing in a format like this and directing?
Well, usually there's a big difference. For a movie like this, there wasn't much of a difference. Yeah, like you said, I've been working as a film editor mostly on documentaries for the last several years. I had never really tried to direct anything. This is the first thing I've directed, and it might well be the last thing I ever direct. I'm happy to go back to editing. Basically, what happened with this movie is I'd been working as a film editor. The pandemic hit. Work got pretty slow in 2020, and I had more free time than I usually do, and I wanted to use it productively in some way. And I thought, well, now's a chance to make something of my own, to make my own movie. The problem is, of course, there was a pandemic, and if I wanted to make a documentary, I couldn't fly around interviewing people and putting a crew together and getting people in the same room. So I was sort of trying to think, how can I do something creative? How can I make a movie, but do it sort of alone in a room without other people? And the solution to that was really to use what I know how to do, which is to edit, take a bunch of material that's already out there, edit it together, and try to tell a story that way. So usually in a documentary, you have a director and you have an editor, and they're doing very different things. This documentary really didn't have a director because it was all editing. No one shot anything. No one interviewed anyone. But I sort of thought it would be weird to have a movie with no director credited. So I gave myself a director credit along with it. But I think of myself mostly as the editor on this, on a directorless movie for this one.
I understand. The film was done entirely with archival footage and contemporary news coverage. Where did you find all this material?
All over the place. The actual footage of the trial I got from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. There's a copy at Yad Vashem, and there's a copy in New York, but D.C. had the best looking copy. So they were very generous and helpful in letting me use their footage. For the news footage, I pretty much reached out to every archive in the world that I'd heard of, and some that I hadn't. Anyone who had material from the early 60s, and just said, send me everything you have on the Eichmann trial. Put it all together, watched through it, and there was a lot of overlap. But then what was interesting is that different countries and different networks had covered this trial in different ways. Some were very interested in, the sort of loss of memory of the Holocaust in Germany. Some were very interested in the logistics of the trial. Some were interested in the journalistic coverage of the trial. And so it was sort of piecing. I mean, in a scene like the scene early on where we show kind of the setting up of the courtroom and the building of Eichmann's box and all the journalists arriving, in that scene alone, there's probably 10, 15 different archives represented, a shot from here, a shot from there. And it was my job to just put it together and hopefully make it seem like it was all sort of flowed, sort of came from the same place.
How many hours of footage did you review to put together this documentary?
So I'll consult my cheat sheet here. So it's interesting. The trial itself, I've heard there were about 500 hours filmed. The whole trial was filmed from beginning to end. The recesses were filmed. Everything was filmed. But it was put onto tape because that was the technology of the early 60s. And over the years, for reasons I haven't really been able to verify, a lot of the tapes disappeared. So a lot of the footage is lost. I'm told it was originally about 500 hours. And when I got it all together, there were about 200 hours remaining. And some of it was duplicates. So really, it was about 130 hours, which is still plenty of footage to watch through, as I can tell you firsthand. And then for the news footage, it was probably about 15 to 20 hours, which sounds like a lot, but you consider this was probably the single most covered news event of 1961. There just wasn't much thought in 1961 to maintaining, reels of film and to keeping them and to labeling them. So a lot of the footage was thrown away. Some of it was probably mislabeled and it's just out there somewhere and, we'll never be able to find it. So I just kind of got what I'm convinced is every frame of footage of news coverage of the Eichmann trial that still exists and can be found, and put it all together. So probably about 15, 20 hours of news footage that I went through.
Amazing. Really, really was amazing. How do you decide what pieces of footage to include to tell the story of the film?
Well, that was the tricky part, because you've got 130 hours of trial footage, and a lot of it's really interesting, really compelling. But I knew I wanted the movie to be, 90 minutes to an hour 45. So really, most of the process of making this movie was going through all that footage, going through the transcripts, and just trying to say what are the key moments and the key scenes that will tell the story I'm trying to tell. I could have made a much longer movie, or I could have made 10 different movies about the Eichmann trial, but it was really about narrowing down what's the story I'm trying to tell, and what are the clips I need to do. And I was sort of trying to tell the story of the Holocaust through the Eichmann trial, which is kind of what the people who were, it's kind of what the prosecutor was trying to do in the trial, was tell the story of the Holocaust. So I sort of had one witness talking about the ostracization of the Jews, one talking about ghettoization, one talking about expulsion, one talking about extermination, trying to sort of hit all the major, milestones along the journey of the Holocaust, so to speak.
I have to ask, why this particular story? What was it about
So
the trial itself that drew your attention?
Well, I kind of made this movie backwards. The way you're supposed to make a documentary is that you come up with a topic you're interested in, and then you research it, you come up with a style or a structure that fits that topic, and then you make your movie. What happened here is, because I had sort of started out by saying I want to make a movie just from archival footage, where I could just make it alone in a room during a pandemic. I then had to sort of find a story that fit that style. And so I was sort of going, I knew it had to be about a person or an event that had been extensively covered in the news, where a lot of footage was readily available. And I thought, well, a trial would work really well, because, you don't need to do much explain. You don't need to interview a bunch of people to explain what a trial is. We know what a trial is. We know the structure of it. We know the characters. There's going to be a defense attorney and a prosecutor and witnesses and judges. And so I just started looking into trials that had been filmed, and I didn't have to look very far, because the first trial that was filmed in its entirety was the Eichmann trial, which I had some awareness of the Eichmann trial. I had a Jewish education. I kind of knew vaguely who he was and that this trial had existed, but I don't think I'd really watched any footage, and I didn't really know a lot of the details. And the more I started looking into it and seeing the footage and reading the transcripts of the trial, I realized there was really a compelling story here. So it was sort of a backwards method of the method first, and then the topic.
Very interesting. I wasn't aware of the fact that this was the very first trial that had ever been covered beginning to end like that.
Yeah, well, Nuremberg, they had shot bits and pieces of Nuremberg, and the guy who kidnapped the Lindbergh baby, they shot parts of his trial. But
Right.
this, we're in the 40s, 50s, you were shooting on film. And film, first of all, you can only shoot 10 minutes at a time. Then you have to take a reel out. You have to put another one in, and it's extremely expensive to buy film. It's extremely expensive to develop film. It's very complicated to duplicate film. So it's not really practical. I mean, to film the Nuremberg trials all the way through could have cost hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. It was just totally impractical. What happened with the Eichmann trial is it was the early 60s, and videotape had been invented. And suddenly you could film an hour all the way through without having to, before having to change a tape. It was very cheap. It was very easy to duplicate. And so suddenly you had the technological mechanism where you could film a trial relatively cheaply over long periods of time. You could duplicate the tapes and send them out everywhere in the world so that they could report on it the next day and show clips from the trial. So it was sort of the perfect timing for technology meeting this particular event. So yeah, I mean, videotape was really the reason.
Now, did you have to digitize a lot of that videotape, or had that work already been done?
The videotapes had been digitized some time ago by Yad Vashem. Digitized their copy. There's copies actually on YouTube if you ever want to sit and watch 200 hours of the Eichmann trial. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, from whom I got the copy that's in the film, they had digitized their copy several years ago and had done a very good job, and their copies on their website. So that was taken care of. For the news footage, the individual archives, I'd say probably half of them had digitized it already, and then half, I could they would send me sort of a list of, here are the tapes that we have, and I would look and sort of say, well, this looks like it would be interesting, this looks like it would be interesting, and then they would digitize it for me. So in some cases, I had, for example, the UCLA Film and Television Archive, which owns all of ABC's news coverage, they were going and digging out reels of film from what I imagine was sort of a Raiders of the Lost Ark-esque warehouse, with just top to bottom film, and they were digitizing it just for use in this movie. So, which was cool because it means there's footage in this movie that there have been a lot of documentaries about Eichmann and the Eichmann trial over the years, but there's footage in this movie that hasn't been seen before. And some footage was digitized just last year for the 60th anniversary of the trial. Some news archives were, kind of digging out their old footage to commemorate the anniversary and digitizing it for the first time. So there's a lot of quote unquote new footage, footage from 1961 that hasn't been seen until now.
Well, I found the film just fascinating. I'm a judge, so I'm used to the concept of trials, and this is what I do every day. I was struck by the fact that you covered right at the beginning. The process was criticized, that the state of Israel should not be the one to try Eichmann, and the defense lawyers even raised the concept of impartiality of the tribunal. Was that something that surprised you?
That was a big surprise. I took it for granted that, you capture this Nazi, there's overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Who would not support putting him on trial, and who wouldn't support putting him on trial in Israel? And there was a lot of pushback, not just from enemies of Israel, but actually from the Jewish community in Israel, and especially the American Jewish community was upset that Israel, not that Eichmann was being put on trial necessarily, but that Israel was putting him on trial in Israel. There was a feeling that Israel, which was still this new democracy that was fending off attacks from all sides, there was this feeling that Israel was sort of overstepping its bounds, that it was acting sort of like a bully by trying to do this trial themselves instead of having some sort of, like you said, an international tribunal. There was a reason that Israel decided they wanted to do the trial themselves, which is the Nuremberg trials, which were done by an international tribunal of basically judges from the Allied powers. The Nuremberg trials, as effective as they were in terms of securing convictions and executions for most of the defendants, they really didn't tell the story of the Holocaust very well. They weren't trying to, but they really didn't convey that the idea of the Holocaust as a crime against the Jewish people. There were no Holocaust survivors who spoke, who were witnesses in Nuremberg. The word, if you look through the Nuremberg transcripts, the word Jew or Jewish doesn't even really come up that often. It's really about war crimes, crimes against humanity. And, to the extent they talked about concentration camps, which they did, they sort of referred to the people in the camps as political prisoners. They didn't really emphasize that these were mostly Jewish people who were not in prison because of their political beliefs, but just because they happened to be Jewish. And so David Ben-Gurion, who in some ways was kind of masterminding the Eichmann trial, said, I want this to sort of serve as a corrective to Nuremberg. I want it to really make it clear to a generation that is too young to remember or understand what the Holocaust was. I want it to make it clear to them that this was a crime against the Jewish people. I want to put all the evidence out there as to the nature of this crime. The word Holocaust wasn't even really used at the time until after the Eichmann trial. The Eichmann trial sort of brought that word into vogue and brought Holocaust education to the fore. So the sort of structure of the trial, where you have these witnesses who in many cases aren't even talking about Eichmann, they're just talking about their experience in the Holocaust, was very, very intentional. And I guess Ben-Gurion felt like the best way to sort of manage that narrative was to have the trial in Israel so that he could appoint his attorney general as prosecutor and sort of, guide him toward giving the public the narrative of the Holocaust. So it was, and Ben-Gurion says it himself in the film, that it's really not about Eichmann's guilt or innocence. That's sort of, it's a given that he's guilty. The real point of the trial is to educate a younger generation on what the Holocaust was, so that, of course, it won't happen again.
And what impact do you think that it had around the world, the Eichmann trial itself?
Well, it had a tremendous effect, especially primarily just on educating the public about the Holocaust, putting the word Holocaust out there. Holocaust survivors had really never been given a chance before the Eichmann trial to share their stories, partly because it was very recent and many of them were sort of trying to establish new lives in Israel and elsewhere. And partly because there just wasn't much interest. The world had sort of turned the corner from World War II. There was nothing like what we have now with the Shoah Foundation. There was no sort of structured attempt to put Holocaust survivors on camera or on record to sort of tell their stories. So the world had never really heard Holocaust survivors speaking in the first person about their time during the Holocaust. And the Eichmann trial really brought them to the fore for the first time. It was the first time many people had seen a Holocaust survivor, albeit on their TV, speaking or heard them speaking about their experience. So it definitely changed the world's understanding of what the Holocaust was. And of course, then there's the second effect it had, which was to reveal the true nature of evil, which in some cases is a bureaucrat sitting at a desk making phone calls and signing documents, and not the sort of cartoonishly evil villains that we tend to see on TV, and that Hitler to some extent was. It sort of showed people in a pretty jarring way that evil can be, to borrow Hannah Arendt's phrase, banal.
Right. Or the administrative assassin, which
right.
is another phrase that you used in the film.
Yeah.
I found it fascinating how long the trial went. Most people, I think their general perception is that trials are pretty quick, that
yeah.
it's a big trial, it's maybe a couple of days. Yet this went on for weeks on end.
Yeah.
And you did a really clever way of getting that point across, showing the day after day after day after day, and how each session started with a bailiff or the Israeli equivalent saying "all rise," and just it was repeated so many times over and over and over again to convey the message that this just went on a long time. Did you find anybody shocked that the trial took such a long time to get through?
I'm not sure ahead of the trial if there was really a sense of how long it was going to go on. I think it probably did last longer than people expected. It was about 4 months for the body of the trial itself, then a 4-month recess for deliberations for the judges, and then even reading the sentence took 2 or 3 days because it was so lengthy. And then there were arguments about the verdict. So I think from the beginning, I'll see if I wrote it down here, that from the beginning to the end of the trial was about 8 months, from beginning to the sentencing of Eichmann to death. It was very lengthy. I think even the judges at certain points were a little, you can see it in the film, we're getting a little perturbed at just how long the trial was taking, how much evidence there was. There were 108, I think, prosecution witnesses. The cross-examination was weeks long. It was extensive, and probably to a fault, insofar as the point of the trial was to sort of educate the public and to provide kind of a dynamic way to educate the public about the Holocaust. At a certain point, attention started to drift a little bit because other things were happening in the world, and this trial had been going on for months already. So maybe there that technique would have been a little more effective if they had streamlined it a little bit. I think maybe part of the idea was to just show how overwhelming the evidence of Eichmann's guilt was. And I think it was just important to the prosecution to get, to make sure every witness got a chance to speak, to make sure every aspect of the Holocaust was covered, to make sure that and of course, Israel also, because of the criticism over Israel's trying Eichmann himself, I think Israel wanted to show that they were being very fair, that Eichmann was going to get every opportunity to respond to accusations, that he would be able to present his own evidence. And so that, of course, linked in the trial too.
And as you showed, he did speak, and his voice was heard. He had defense counsel. Any repercussions from the defense counsel after the trial was over?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think he ever even spoke about the trial. Servati is kind of an interesting character in himself, and I wasn't able to find a piece of footage that could convey this in the movie, but his background was that he had actually been, as a much younger man, a defense attorney at Nuremberg. In fact, in the opening of the movie, where you see the Nuremberg footage, if you squint really carefully, you can kind of see him in the background. He had, I think, 3 or 4 clients that he was defending at Nuremberg. And so, it was interesting when Eichmann was captured. Obviously, the thought was, we'll have an Israeli lawyer defend him. And they went out looking for an Israeli lawyer willing to take the case. And they all just said, this is career suicide. I can't be on, international television defending a Nazi in an Israeli courtroom. So they literally could not find an Israeli defense attorney willing to take the case. And I guess Eichmann's family, he had a wife and a couple of kids, had sort of heard about Servatius from his time in Nuremberg and said, let's reach out and contact this guy. And he was interested, but of course there's this problem, which is you can't just go to another country where you haven't passed the bar or practiced law or anything and suddenly, try a case. So as I understand it, Knesset actually had to meet and pass like this one-time exception law to allow Servatius to come to Israel and practice law in a country where, he had not been certified to practice law. And they paired him up with a couple of Israeli I don't know if they were law students or paralegals to help him translate things and sort of understand the legal system. So that was sort of how he became involved in the case. But from what I understand, once the Eichmann trial was over and the appeals were over, he went back to Germany, never spoke about the trial, never wrote about the trial, and as far as I know, just went back to practicing law in Germany.
Fascinating. It's, one of the points of any legal system is to set aside your emotions and do your job and follow the law and follow the evidence. And that's what the judges in this instance decided that they were going to do, that they weren't biased, that like any judge, they were human beings, but it was their job to set aside their emotions and to conduct a fair trial. The same would apply to defense counsel as well. Your job is to defend someone and make sure the law is followed and make sure that procedures are fair, but you're not passing on your opinion of your client at all. I wonder if the public saw it that way, or if there were any discussion about his role at all as defense lawyer.
There was, I mean, I think the public, there was a lot of opposition to the trial when it was first announced, and there were all these arguments being made in public and private about, like I said, should this trial be held at all? Can a person be found guilty of the Holocaust? Such a huge crime, can it be pinned on one person like this? And of course, all these arguments about Israel's jurisdiction. Most of that faded away once the trial began. There were international observers there. It was being televised, and I think people saw very quickly that this trial was being conducted in a fair way, that Israel had really, taken steps to make sure that Eichmann was, going to have a good defense, to the point that they passed this law allowing him to have proper defense counsel from Germany. So from what I can tell from watching news footage and reading about the trial, there wasn't a lot of pushback to the trial once it began. There was some pushback to the sentence, which is a lot of people felt like, it's one thing to find him guilty, but maybe he shouldn't be sentenced to death. Here's an opportunity. And this argument was coming from Jewish people around the world. Here's an opportunity for Jews to sort of show, not contrition's not the right word, but to show, how humane they are in contrast with the Nazis by giving him, a life sentence or a sentence of hard labor or something instead of the death sentence. Ultimately, the prosecution did ask for the death sentence, and obviously did get it. But I think most to the extent that there was any discussion about the trial, about the trial's fairness once it began, it was mostly about the sentence and not about the trial itself.
And that debate still goes on, by the way, about the death penalty in all different contexts, not just with Eichmann, but in all different contexts. And I don't know that there's any better answer today than there was in the early 1960s.
No, not.
I just don't think that there is. Are there any other takeaways that you hope that our audience will get from watching your documentary?
I mean, there were certainly things that I learned from making, which it's always nice when you learn something new while you're making a movie. And there were things that really surprised me about this, not just the fact that there was discussion and disagreement about holding the trial at all or holding it in Israel, but it was definitely educational for me to see just how little knowledge and understanding there was of the Holocaust. I sort of took it for granted that Holocaust education had always been what it is today. It was taught in high schools, it was taught in colleges, everyone knew about it. And it was definitely surprising to me to see how little it was known and understood in the early 60s. And I think that's a lesson for today. We still take it for granted that Holocaust education is what it is, but surveys are consistently showing that people don't really understand what the Holocaust was, especially younger people don't know the number of Jews killed, don't understand, the nature of it and how what was happening in concentration camps. So I think one of the takeaways is just that we can't take Holocaust education for granted. It's something that we need to continue to work actively for, because it can take, just a few years for the world to forget about it, even 15 years after it happened. That was a big lesson for me. And I think another big takeaway for me was just, watching hours and hours of Eichmann on the stand was sort of how you're watching a person who's been accused of terrible crimes. He's been presented with literally thousands of documents and other forms of evidence, witness testimony as to his guilt. And he's still sitting there sort of sheepishly denying having had anything to do with it. And I think a takeaway for me personally was just how sort of pathetic he seemed on the stand at a certain point, just saying, well, I was only following orders. I couldn't have possibly known what was going on. I couldn't have been responsible. I think we all have moments in our lives where we try to shirk responsibility for something that we do kind of know is our responsibility. And I think watching how just pathetic Eichmann seemed when he continued to sort of try to avoid responsibility for something that he was just so clearly responsible for was something that I think is going to stick with me for a long time.
Yeah, one of the things that shocked me, because I kept looking for some glimmer in him of acknowledgement of his culpability,
Mhm.
and he sort of said, "Yeah, I might have been an accomplice from sort of a human point of view, but certainly not a legal point of view." And
Yeah.
and I'm not sure there's a real distinction there. But what popped out at me is, he said from a human point of view, and I had trouble reconciling what he did with being a human being at all, because how
Yeah.
could a human being do this? So does he even have any acknowledgement that he's a human being?
I mean,
That's to reconcile.
yeah, people have been arguing for 60 years and probably could still argue today. And I, having watched this whole trial and read the transcript and made the movie, am still not sure I have an answer. I don't know whether Eichmann knew he was guilty and was just going to fight till the end to convince people he wasn't, or whether he was just in denial and I almost think he may have just created this sort of construct of, well, I'm guilty from a legal point of view, from not a human point of view. I think it was sort of a construct he created for himself in order. I don't know how you live otherwise. I don't know how you can look at yourself in the mirror knowing what he had done, without sort of creating a new reality for yourself where you say, well, I had to do what I did. It was terrible, but I was following orders, and I have legal guilt, but not moral guilt. And I really felt terrible about it, but I had to do it. I think you could still debate. My instinct is he probably knew he was guilty, but had just, in order not to feel guilty, had sort of created this construct of his own devising that legal guilt and moral guilt were completely different, and he had no moral responsibility for what he had done.
Right. You have to put up pretty strong boxes within your own brain to separate things that way.
Yes. Yes.
Pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing they could do that. But I was staring at his face to see if I could read anything in his expression, and you really just are left with more questions than anything about
Yeah.
it. You really are. You really are.
That's been that was kind of the narrative for many years about about Eichmann's behavior in court, is that he was sort of expressionless and emotionless. And I did try to push back on that a little bit in the movie, because when you really watch him carefully, you'll start to see little micro expressions and little betrayals of emotion here and there. But at the end of the day, he just sits there and says, "I'm not guilty," and tries to portray himself as the victim, and then walks out of the courtroom. So I don't think that the sort of narrative we've heard for 60 years, that Eichmann never smiled and never looked at the audience and never acknowledged anything that was being said. I don't know if that's strictly true, but it's also hard to really see any dramatic change in his emotion over the course of the trial. By the end of it, he's still kind of a statue.
Right, right. Just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And I think that the word banal, really fits in many respects. I can see why Hannah Arendt came up with that expression. It just seemed to fit there. It really did.
Yeah.
It really did. Well, I cannot thank you enough for being here today and talking with our audience, with our viewers. This is really a fascinating film, not just to me because I know a little something about the legal system, but it really did seem to light a spark in Holocaust education. And if that's what it took around the world, great. I'm glad it did it.
Yeah.
It may have been 15 years after the war was over, but at least it got started.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I know that in Germany today, there is quite a bit of discussion about the Holocaust and about Germany's past, maybe even more so than in the United States today. But there's a lot of discussion in the United States as well. And you're right, we do take it for granted. So thank you for showing us all where it got started in such a fascinating way.
Thank you.
I really want to thank you for joining us. And I also want to thank all of our sponsors, our community partners, our volunteers, and all of the film lovers who are participating in the Miami Jewish Film Festival. So thank you for giving us the time, and thank you for this remarkable film.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me and for watching it.